Awesome. Alrighty, everyone. We have a full house. I'm sure we still have a few more stragglers, but we might get started. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. This is a very, very exciting event, celebrating not one, but three wonderful titles with three wonderful authors covering intricate aspects of Australian theatre. Before we jump into things, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, which we're currently on in Reimagined, which is the Yagara and Turrbal people, as well as the traditional owners of the land, which are joining us from on Zoom, as we're also live streaming tonight. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Some general housekeeping for everyone. The bathrooms, you can just use the ones inside. They're just up the stairs behind the counter. Helen will be able to show you the way if you get lost. Towards the end of the event, so at around 7:15, we will have some time for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please just save them until the end. We do have some books, the books tonight, these wonderful titles. You can purchase them inside. We do have a select quantity, but if you're really after it, we can also order them in for you. And then afterwards, we will move inside. You can mingle, have some more drinks. The bar will be open. And finally, if you could take a minute just to pop your phone on silent, that would be greatly appreciated. Now, I will throw over to Vanessa Tomlinson from the Creative Arts Research Institute, who will introduce you to our fabulous authors. Please welcome Vanessa.
Thank you, and thanks to Avid Reader for having us here tonight. I too would like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. The Creative Arts Research Institute's at South Bank, also on the same lands, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to share that these have always been lands of creativity, learning and teaching. I've never done a triple book launch before. I don't know if I'm more nervous or the three triple book launchees are more nervous. I started the Creative Arts, well, I became director of the Creative Arts Research Institute a year ago, and it was to bring together researchers from across the Queensland Conservatorium, Queensland College of Art and Griffith Film School. And I didn't know that inside those three areas was an incredible powerhouse of theatre. It was kind of an untapped treasure, and it's been emerging slowly. The people that are involved in this area from different disciplines, and you'll see three superstars of that tonight. I mentioned that I'm from Griffith University, and I just want to acknowledge some of the Griffith University staff that are here tonight. The Dean of Research, AEL, Professor Jerry Doherty, the Director of the Queensland College of Art, Professor Elizabeth Findlay, the Director of the Humanities, Languages and Social Sciences, Professor Michael Ontaji, and also Professor Sue Travaskas from the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research. Come on, that was good. Now, when there's a triple book launch, there's a big temptation, at least for me, to find all the commonalities in this work. And there's certainly a lot of commonalities about the presence of place, the presence of now, the presence of ecology, the presence of climate, which gives a kind of urgency to all of this work. I don't know actually if the three authors knew each other before Kari began, shaking of hands, yeah. But it's certainly been interesting watching their research together grow. They have a current grant which is looking at sustainability in Australian theatre companies, and it's really amazing watching how the findings of that are coming to bear and how that's going to actually influence Australian theatre going forward. There was also a beautiful talk that Linda did yesterday about science-art collaborations and how theatre can have a really active role to play in rethinking climate action. So there's some interesting threads that are coming out. Those of you who follow any publications like The Conversation or Arts Hub will be familiar with Julian Meyrick's amazing work in the area of cultural policy and activism in that space. I was just reading his piece about the, finally, an arts policy came out of Labor on Monday, and the incredible detail that was in that note. It's actually really great to have strong thinkers in the arts at Griffith sharing this kind of knowledge on a national scale. So thanks for all your work in that area, Julian. Okay, but it's not about a collective, it's about these three individuals. So I want to actually just give you a little bit of information about the three individuals, and then I'll pass it over to them to speak one by one before we have questions at the end. First up tonight is Dr. Tanya Beer, who's a senior lecturer in design at Queensland College of Art at Griffith University. And she has a career as an ecological designer, community artist, and researcher, building on more than 20 years of practice. I know I wasn't going to do any more collective talking, but what's actually amazing about these three is that they're practitioners and writers. So their writing is all informed by decades of practice in the field of theatre, and I think that's a pretty amazing strength. Her book is called Ecoscenography. It's based on her work in her PhD, and I'm sure she'll talk about the title, but a year ago, I couldn't say that word without getting tongue twisted, and now it's in my lexicon. So I think that's a huge attribute to her work, but also understanding how eco-knowledge can actually be part of many facets of our artistic life. Dr. Linda Hassall is a senior lecturer in applied theatre in the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Sciences, and has about 30 years of practice as a theatre director and a dramaturg, mostly based in Queensland. She now links her knowledge and application of artistic practices to landscape and eco-critical perspectives in contemporary performance. Her artistic research concerns development and analysis of contemporary Australian climate, Gothic Australian performance, and she's an award-winning playwright as well as a director. Professor Julian Meyrick is Professor of Creative Arts at Griffith University, again in the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Sciences. And both Linda and Julian are members of CURRI and members of the GCSCR. He's also the literary advisor for the Queensland Theatre, general editor of Currency House, New Platform Papers, which I very much encourage you to read if you haven't. He comes from a political and economic background before going into theatre, and has been active as a theatre director, a cultural policy analyst, and also a theatre historian. So I am pretty excited. I think this is an amazing historic moment to have 3 books on Australian theatre practices being launched in West End in 2022. So please make welcome all 3 and Tanya Beer.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? This seems really, yeah, hang on. Okay, thank you, Vanessa, for that really beautiful introduction, and it's an honour to be here tonight with my 2 esteemed colleagues, Linda Hassall and Julian Meyrick, to be launching my book locally, and to be in my old stomping ground of Brisbane. This is where I grew up and where I cut my teeth as a stage designer. So, and we've just actually come back to Brisbane in the last month to live here. So it's really wonderful to be in situ and in real life with those of you in the room, and thank you also to those that are joining us online. So I'm going to launch pretty quickly into reading. We're all going to read a part of our book tonight, and I'm going to read my preface because I suppose it gives a kind of personal take on why I wrote this book. And as Vanessa mentioned, it came out of my PhD, which I started over 10 years ago. And it was very much informed also from my postdoctorate work. And it is very much built on practitioner knowledge. And it's really about imagining what theatre design can be in a world that really puts ecological practice and thinking at the heart of what we do. It's very aspirational. And in many ways it's very personal as well. And it's really it's the first book of its kind that is not just about practice, it's also about philosophy, a new philosophy for theatre making. And there's a lot of wonderful colleagues of mine that have worked a lot in transforming theatre practice for a sustainable future. But I also think we need a new way of thinking. So that's what this book is about. And scenography, for those of you who are not theatre makers, you may not know, but scenography is kind of, I guess, another way of saying stage design, scenographic scenography, and ecoscenography made the most sense. So it's a term that I developed as part of my PhD. So ecological design for performance. So this is my preface. Like many stage designers, my interest in sustainability emanates from the scale of environmental challenges our society faces and the desire to contribute to a positive future. Looking back, it is difficult to pinpoint a single moment that ignited my passion for ecological practice. Was it seeing my set thrown in a skip one too many times, or perhaps feeling physically ill from the toxic fumes inhaled while expending several cans of spray paint on a single prop? Or being confronted by Al Gore's The Inconvenient Truth and his uncompromising depiction of the threat of climate change, that the threat of climate change represents to current and future generations. No doubt, each of these events has played a role. I have long been passionate about environmental and social issues for as long as I can remember. I grew up with a strong desire and indeed privilege to incorporate ecological considerations into my day-to-day life, buying food from local markets, taking public transport, avoiding single-use plastics, turning off lights, recycling and composting. However, when I walked into the theatre, all these considerations seemed to fall away. Somehow theatre gave me the license to do the things I would never do at home. Perhaps it was because I was never taught to critique theatre practices from an ecological perspective or query the consequences of my design intentions. Decadence was not questioned in my era of design education. On the contrary, it was encouraged if the budget would allow for it. We were trained to work towards opening night. How we got there was neither a priority nor a consideration. I simply did not know how to integrate ecological concerns with my creative endeavours. This all changed in 2008, when I had the opportunity to work as an exhibition designer at one of Australia's major museums. The job came with a unique selling point, a team of ecologically conscious designers who were keen to put sustainability at the heart of what they did. Part of my job was to conduct research into sustainable strategies and products, a challenging task for a designer with no prior knowledge or experience in this area. It was not long until I was confronted with the uncomfortable realization that my values were at odds with my design practices. Suddenly, I had a deep concern about the materials, products, and life cycle of my sets and costumes. I realized that despite only scratching the surface on the sustainability agenda, I already knew too much. There was no turning back. In 2008, there was very little material available on the subject of ecological design for performance. And I clearly remember searching the internet and being dismayed at a lack of resources on the subject. while I found material on sustainable practices from other design fields, there seemed to be a gaping hole when it came to theatre. Why weren't we thinking about the consequences of what we design? Why had I myself only started to question it now? This questioning sparked a series of investigations into my own practice, and finally the commencement of my PhD thesis on the topic 3 years later, in 2011. So this book provides an introduction to ecological design for performance, outlining my own research in the field over the last decade and showcasing the burgeoning body of work being produced by ecological theatre makers around the world. I am, of course, not alone in engaging with this topic. In recent years, sustainability has emerged as a significant part of many high-profile performance platforms, both in programming and in practice across the globe. Pioneers in ecological theatre practice are demonstrating how the performing arts can be a unique and powerful platform to imagine and inspire new realities, with productions designed on sustainable principles, demonstrating new approaches and artistic insights. My motivation here is to synthesize the field for both established theatre makers wanting to engage with the topic and the next generation who, my own experience tells me, are yearning to contribute to a rapidly changing world. As we collectively face the reality that our practices have consequences, we are also presented with the opportunity to remake our profession. This ecological turning is a pivotal point in the history of the performing arts to be defined by theatre makers of today, but particularly by those of tomorrow. The aim of this book is to catalyse ecological practices in performance design, providing a foundation from which new practices, new aesthetics and novel thinking can emerge. The urgency for this reimagining has never been greater. Climate change, mass species loss, drought, forest felling and acidifying oceans pose immense threats to our environment, our society and our culture. In This Is Not a Drill, an Extinction Rebellion handbook published in 2019, climate activist Dougal Hine summed up this era as times in which impossible things happen. Hine's prophetic words were at the foundation or the forefront of my mind as I sat down to write this book in early January 2020, when my adopted homeland of Australia was literally on fire. By the end of what is now known as the Black Summer, and this is when I was living in Melbourne, wildfires had burnt 19 million hectares, destroyed 2,779 homes and killed 34 people. An estimated 1 billion mammals, birds, reptiles and amphibians perished, and the fires contributed more CO2 into the atmosphere than Australia's annual emissions. Smoke turned the sky red in New Zealand and blanketed its glaciers in smoke and ash. The fires, driven by unprecedented drought and heat, brought home the urgency of the climate crisis and the need to reshape our relations with the environment that supports us. And I strongly believe that art and culture have a powerful role to play in this reformation. We also stand at a unique moment in time to pursue an ecological turn in the performing arts. The last 12 months, spanning 2020, 2021, has brought with it a global pandemic that has enforced a pause in our practices, just as theatre has called to restart our economy with a green revolution. Just as there have been calls to restart our economy with a green revolution, so too can we start theatre practices with a new ecological ethic. The pandemic has brought home the inherent inequality that underlines and intersects with that climate crisis, demonstrating that the ecological is social and political. We must convene to tackle this moment in our history with humility, gusto, and resourcefulness. For me, the underlying spirit of this movement is one of opportunity. In forced sustainable practice in further negative, they suggest unwelcome constraints. On the contrary, I'm interested in how the coming decades can be framed as a time of potential, an era when theatre artists rise to the challenge of what it means to bring an ecological perspective into their work, not because they are forced to, but because they embrace the transformative potential that it brings. Related industries such as architecture, product design and fashion have already shown us how an ecological ethic can reap enormous rewards. It is my hope that this book will help reveal these opportunities to performance designers and theatre makers alike, and, as outlined above, provide a foundation from which ecological practices can build in the coming decades. There is already a whiff of revolution in the air. Sustainability with a capital S is finally here, and the time is now to seize the potential that this new era in performing arts brings. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. I met Tanya a few years ago at a conference in Melbourne, and since then she's been one of my heroes, I think. And I was so happy when I found out that she'd moved to Griffith University, and I thought, I'm going to stalk her, and I did. And here we are. I guess my book looks at similar ideas, but from a playwriting perspective. So I'm going to be talking about the art making, I guess, in my book, Theatres of Dust. Before I start, I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners, but I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I grew up on, the Darugul people. So I pay my respect to their elders past and present, because I think that landscape is what shaped me, and that's why I am here today. I'd also like to acknowledge that the discussions in this book about landscape, legacy and identity are formulated from my very privileged position as a white middle-class female and academic. And as such, I respectfully acknowledge that many First Nation and Torres Strait Islander peoples do not share a sense of harmony with non-Indigenous discussions about the land. So I think that's important for me to acknowledge, because I work in landscape spaces. So I think I had to do that. And I love to do that. I've always loved this landscape, the Australian landscape. The stories my grandfather, a drover in his youth, yes, I am that old, told me as a child growing up enthralled me. The dry and dusty central Queensland town of my childhood was the sort of place that embedded such stories in the working class socio-cultural roots. I was mesmerised by the country and the tragedy of those who worked in it or battled to survive it and its bastard weather. The heat, the songs, the smell, the dust, the distance of that landscape has never left me. The landscape of my childhood calls to me still, and I try to capture my response to its calling in my writing. She is always behind me, the distance. She smells red. Her colours blow the gilt winds that whisper history. The winds reach across the distance and coat me in the dust of the landscape of my past. And I can almost smell that thin, raggedy girl wearing hand-me-down clothes, barefoot in the dirt, long blonde hair tangled down her back, her eyes always on the horizon, waiting for something. That girl is still within me. She's sometimes the woman in my work. She fears now that in the centre, green is almost forgotten, a distant memory laid in dirt. Back then, a sky the colour of kerosene, of day-old bruises streaked in nicotine-glazed clouds, turned to bitter memory as fearful night battles for its place in the desert. At the back of me is always the memory of the land, breathing the distant dry smell of the bones of those who came before me. Their names never noted in plaques, or scratched into tree stumps, or chiselled on the face of monuments. Shh. Listen. A scalding national anthem whispers as the land cracks, but no longer bleeds. My memory reveals a sun-baked landscape of misremembrances, of place, a dusty, irreal time wherein a vivid physical and psychological landscape tapestry was even then unravelling. Playwriting and performance making now provides me with the opportunity of being able to grapple with the irresistible pull of these common thematic threads. And I attempt to grasp the landscape by focusing my artistic imaginings on place, geography, distance, space, belonging, salvation, damnation, dust. I am now perhaps a long way from my childhood, and that aerial landscape, its nostalgic memory, is changing. The winds reaching across the distance are more vicious, whispering a different story as the land transforms, and the climate-ravaged future is becoming more and more visible through the distance. Like what is buried deep within my own memory, the national psychology of the ancient and ethereal landscape narrates a space wherein the country itself plays out like a theatrical production, with heat, erosion, and increasing catastrophic weather events the lead protagonists. Despite being an arid country that has always experienced extensive drought, devastating cyclones, and catastrophic bushfires, Australia can still be described as a country that is largely unpolluted and underpopulated. And it is perhaps this paradox that lulls us into a national legacy, wherein some boast in our self-deprecating Australian time, climate change, it's something that more than likely is happening, will happen, maybe a little bit now, but sometime in the future. And maybe when it does, we'll deal with it like we've always dealt with weather in this bastard country. Battle it or be beaten down by it. The Australian landscape is and always has been a chimerical beast. The theatre artists in this book are exploring how our historical relationships with land, coal and cattle, habitat, cultural geography, non-human species and consumer and material practices are informing new descriptions of Australian spaces. Informed by climate science, the plays discussed respond to the changing landscape and as such are contributing to the climate discussion. The dramatic form framing the discussion draws significantly on the Australian Gothic. At the back of me is always the memory of the land breathing, the distant dry smell of the bones of those who came before me. The Gothic framing suggests that climate change is a contemporary monster of our own making, and that the plays narrate how it is rearing its ugly head, spewing fire and flood fury, while simultaneously devouring the country with extreme drought. They depict the landscape itself as a Gothic paradox of reversals. I identify this paradox through an Australian climate Gothic lens. The Australian climate Gothic claims that the notion of landscape is transforming into what I further describe as climatescape. Climatescape is a dramatic concept that describes both physical and psychological space. It is in this space that our enduring ability to beat the odds and battle everything the landscape throws at us is heroic memory, a myth quickly disappearing beneath a globally warmed blanket, a distant memory layered in dust and belonging to the popular colonial ethos of the past, perhaps. However, ultimately, the plays discussed in this book are hopeful. Hope seems to be a vague and abstract concept when dealing with the problems of the Anthropocene, when we are all exhausted, anxious, and despairing about the legacies we will leave future generations, my daughter, my granddaughters. However, hope is evident in all of the plays discussed in this book. There is hope for behavioural change in dust. There is hope for the development of a healthier land management strategy and salvation. There's hope for improved conservation of habitat and non-human species care in they saw a thylacine in the dead devils of Cockle Creek. There is hope for a more racially united collaboration of land rights and care issues in the White Earth. There is hope for better support for isolated farming communities in the floods. And there is hope for better political management of the environmental issues in the turquoise elephant. And finally, there is hope for the conservation of precious Australian resources in water wars. In this cultural climate where our desert spaces and unique places are diminished and homes and habitats are consistently degraded or obliterated, the plays delve deep into contemporary questions about what it is to be human and what it is to be human right now. Many significantly ask us to reassess our humanity, to consider our treatment of that which is other, and to at the very least empathise with non-human nature and species, to strive for a planet where we can continue to cohabitate for as long as possible. While the global catastrophe is in progress and we are living in the Anthropocene's continually warming world, the climate Gothic attempts to make sense of, or at least explore ways to communicate our relationships with non-human nature and species in ways that science or environmental fields just can't. Climate Gothic drama uses the cultural platform of the stage to synthesize factual research with speculative, theatrical imagination. It can therefore draw on scientific discussion to tease out emotional rather than technical responses to climate change or experiences. While the plays referred to in this book do not provide any concrete answers to escalating weather events, disappearing habitats, rising sea levels, or the impact of colonising processes on the land, they do suggest Australian theatre artists and theatre makers are taking up the challenge in including climate change as an important topic for cultural expression. The Dramatic Imaginations by playwrights Stephen Carlton, who is in the audience tonight, thank you Stephen, Sean Charles, Catherine Marquette, Jackie Smith, Elaine Eckworth, Justine Campbell, Sarah Hamilton, and myself attempt to provide some insight into how environmental analysis can be more broadly shared, how theatre can speak to people in a way that science cannot, and further, how the theatrical imagination can offer a platform to situate important climate discussions. I've always loved the landscape, the Australian landscape. She's always behind me, whispering to me. Her stories still enthrall me.
Yes. Actually, I have to see it just because of the lights. That's all right.
Sure.
I can. Oh, I see if I can raise
It would be
it. Actually,
better if you could.
I just don't want your head to be chopped.
No, well, others would disagree. Of course, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I stand. I wrote a book on so many different bits of land, I couldn't even begin to list them. I'd also like to acknowledge my own personal elder, Professor Owen McCarthy, who is my father-in-law. Professor McCarthy is finishing his own book at the moment, and I'm absolutely certain that he is the most senior writer writing with the Queensland Writers' Centre.
Wow.
So when on those rare occasions in my artistic or academic life, I have done something original, I have experienced the same feeling, a profound sense of disorientation, of knowing somehow less than I did before, and of being confronted by stark realization of the limits of my own imagination and ability to make a difference. It is as if getting up one day and going out, all the road markings and street signs have been rubbed away, and a geography once so familiar is one I can no longer name. I have aimed for success to connect with readers or audiences, but the dark gift of this disorientation is to shatter pre-existing expectations. With a shock, I realized I no longer know what success is, what connecting with readers or audiences mean. I am humbled by this experience and confounded by it. I wrote this book while either ill or in lockdown. I had to write it quickly, but it is built on the bones of two other books, one of which took almost a decade to complete. Because of the ultra-tight deadline, I was sending off individual chapters for editing as I finished them. The book can be seen as a collection of love letters to Australian drama, and certainly I have described it like this because it is a work of passion and heart, not only a product of critical intellect. The aim of the book is simple: to explain and explore the relationship between Australian drama and Australian national life, to show that this is the deepest kind, that it is at once artistically skilled, culturally courageous, and politically insightful. That it has been and remains intimate witness to all the events, anguishes, hopes and aspirations that characterize our lives together as Australians, and that define us as a people and give us the wherewithal to make decisions together that better us all and not just some of us. Drama has been absolutely central to the narrative of the coherence of the country of which we are a part, more central than I could have guessed as a passionate lover of drama. The book shows how and why this is the case, and it shows it in detail. I wrote the book for people like you rather than people like me. That is, for readers who, while liking drama well enough perhaps, may not know why it has the place in their lives that it does, or leaving the theatre having been deeply moved by what they have seen, struggle to say why this is the case. There is a geeky side to the book that was fun for me to write. It involves explaining how a play works and how it achieves its complex effects. It's like analysing a game of chess. So another way of looking at the book is as a succession of recreated chess games, with me demonstrating how each one wins in the sense of fully achieving its own nature, and how each win contributes to the expanding thematic horizon and increasing imaginative resources available to the next chess player who sits down at the board. Right now, and in theatre scholarship, I know best, the focus and concern is with difference. Analysis means separating things out and showing how these things are distinct. I understand why this is the case. We are still recovering from the damage caused by imperializing grand narratives. But the danger here is not only that in making our categories ever more precise, we make them ever smaller, but that we can miss the often surprising connections between things, including things that on the surface appear quite dissimilar. This is another thread in my book. I try to show how different plays in the Australian dramatic repertoire speak to each other in form, content, and what I call compelling mood. I try to illuminate Australian drama as a collective body of work, rather than as a pegboard of individual achievement. The pronouns driving it forward are us and we, rather than her, him, or I. The book covers the 120-year period from Australian Federation in 1901 to just before COVID hit in 2020. The last play I examine is Glaze Chase's XXX, which I saw at the QT in March 2021, though its opening night had been scheduled for 12 months before then. Perhaps it is here that my spiritual troubles began. I read the plays into Australia's history and Australia's history into the plays. That history is disturbing, not only because of the awful things that Australia did during this time, but because the major events of the 20th and 21st century are truly terrifying. And Australians' entanglement in them is like a nightmare that just keeps going on and on. I saw, or felt I saw, that the way we cope with this is to institute a principle of forgetting in our collective lives, to use the phrase going forwards often and with determination, to keep our minds fixed on the possibilities ahead rather than the disasters behind. Before he died, I had the opportunity of presenting my bewilderment at this attitude, I won't say discussing it, to the late historian Stuart McIntyre, who I discovered lived around the corner from me in Melbourne. I got the impression he had heard this pained complaint many times before. It is a willed disconnection from history that I have no resources, either as an artist or a scholar or as a person, to combat. Perhaps the most important line in my book is a quote from the Indigenous painter Gordon Bennett: "No future without a past." And I can only say again that I believe this to be absolutely true. There can be no going forwards to anywhere new without knowing, first and always, where we have come. The past is not another country, because the country in which we live is a manifestation of the past. It is constantly around us. I began this book wanting to write about Australian drama. I ended it having confronted the immense problem of writing about Australia itself. In this task, I have done my best. As I grappled with the challenge of it, I felt myself getting smaller, my expectations and benchmarks for success exploding one by one, like surplus ordnance. You cannot say the story I have told, a story that is not mine, but is mine to tell because it is everyone's story, without asking this profound question. What does it mean to live a good life in Australia now? It is a question that, hand on heart, I can say every one of the 50 plays I look at in this book asks too, and many other plays do besides. So though my book is historically based, it is in fact, and in every way, about the moment we are in now, and the possibilities of thought, action, and imagination we face now. After some anguish and reflection, I have therefore accepted that the disorientation that writing this book has caused in me is one that will be a part of me for some time to come, and I must stay open to it. COVID, I think, finished many things for all of us, many accepted lines of thought, many expectations. So perhaps I'm not the only one who feels the way I do. This book has a summative quality to it. It gets the story of Australian drama to the foot of the collective experience that is the global pandemic, and it leaves it there. End of season 1, so to speak. Season 2 to be announced shortly. What will be the genre of season 2? Tragedy or comedy? Disaster, horror, or action thriller? I have no idea. I do know that whatever happens next in the life and the soul of the Australian nation, then Australian drama will reflect, and occasionally command it. It will speak to us of ourselves, individually and collectively, in a voice that will challenge, comfort, and change us in the deep well of our being. All we have to do is hear it.
Move our chairs up now.
Okay.
All right, I'll pack away my chair. You can all sit on my chair. Just one. Sorry, maybe just one. Alrighty, so we will move to our question time. Instead of passing the microphone around, we'll play it a little COVID safe. And if you could just project, that would be wonderful. Who would like to kick us off? Oh, don't be shy, guys.
Come on, theatre people.
Yeah, you're here.
I've got a question for Julian. What's the play of the 50 that you look at, which you think captures best the Australian stereotype or works against it?
Oh, okay. Well, there's a few plays in the book that look at what Peter Fitzpatrick called the awful Australians. And I think you could say they're a carefully evolving type. So there's a few different ones that kind of capture that. One of the questions that's in the book that asks Australian theatre artists started to ask very early on, which is, who is an Australian? And I think it's a question that never goes away. And I do have an answer to it of a kind now that is not race-based. And if you buy me a glass of wine afterwards, I'll tell you.
Yes.
I have a question for Tanya. I wonder, which are there some examples of projects that you think are potentially the most transformative within theatre, but have impact beyond theatre?
Yeah, okay, great question. Thanks, Heidi. So in my book, I give a lot of examples of theatre collectives and stage designers that are doing incredible work across the globe. One of my favourite examples is a group, I suppose they're a collective or an organisation, they're called Organic Theatre. They're based in India. They mix, it's kind of agriculture meets theatre culture. They work with local communities to basically do organic, basically teach communities organic agriculture, which is also intermixed with cultural practices, traditional cultural practices in India. There's ceremony, there's performance across the season. There's an ecological story that gets performed within that community with community members as part of the harvesting of what is grown. It is a theatre practice and story that takes multiple years to develop. So it really, in terms of time and scale, it's really interesting. So it's really kind of transforming what we think theatre is. And that has literally changed communities in India. And I just love how it's a non-Western example too. And also how it's embedded in cultural practices and how theatre can, and I love the idea of agriculture, you know, that's really sort of agri and culture coming together. So it's probably my favourite example in the book.
Another question? Everyone over that side's being very quiet.
Maybe a question to all three writers. But having spent this time in your book and I guess collectively thinking about the past and the future, could you name one of your greatest fears for Australian theatre and your greatest hope for Australian theatre?
Nice question. Yeah, Linda, you go.
I think that both of those questions are tied together because I think from my perspective, one of my concerns at this point in time is that we have a lot of playwrights and theatre makers essentially working with these particular themes that Tanya and I are talking about. But we're working in practices that aren't sustainable. So one of my greatest fears is that we are not going to be supported to go forward positively in sustainable theatre futures. One of my greatest hopes is that we will be. Because I think theatre, as we've all touched on, I think it's that interface between an audience and something else.
When you say supported, do you mean by the producers of those works? Or
producers, government, communities, all sorts of. And you know, Tanya writes about this a lot. She says, because historically people think that if we produce theatre sustainably, we are doing dodgy art, which isn't actually true, because it's interesting that the people that are leading the field in sustainable theatre making are independent theatre makers, because they have to think creatively. Yeah. And in thinking creatively, they are being more sustainable. So I think this mindset that if we think sustainably or if we create things sustainably, our art or our aesthetic is going to be compromised, I actually don't think that's true anymore. I nailed it.
I was just going to say on that note, I as a practitioner and as a theatre maker and stage designer, for me, being an ecological designer makes me a better theatre maker and a better designer. I really believe that to be true. And I talk about this sometimes, you know, we're talking about fears and hope, I suppose. When in 2012, I was part of a beautiful group called Greening Our Performance. It was a bit of a wave of sustainability initiatives back in Melbourne. And we had a little gathering of theatre people from, I suppose, the theatre crowd in Melbourne. And we were sort of talking about sustainability in those early days, I suppose. And there were lots of, there was a moment where there was a bit of tension in the room about what that meant for theatre practice. And I remember one person in the room got up and said, theatre and sustainability don't mix. Those words were actually spoken. And I thought, and I was just at the start of my PhD, and I thought, well, I will show you. So I think, you know, that was a good kind of motivation for me to actually to show that as a designer, sustainability can be fun, engaging, exciting, beautiful, you know, aesthetically exhilarating. I mean, my notion of aesthetics is very expanded anyway. I don't understand how we can consider something to be beautiful if it ultimately degrades living systems. I just can't understand that. We've got a way to go in the sort of consciousness, I suppose, in the way we see aesthetics. But yeah, my hope is that we're going to shift that aesthetic, those expectations. That I think that I don't know. I'm predicting that audiences will also hold theatre makers to account. That time has already come. I've been taking a lot of solace in diversity on stage and seeing diverse stories, diverse bodies, diverse cultures on stage, which was really needed to happen a long time ago. But we're seeing how, you know, people are basically saying something. If we don't see that diversity on stage, people are reprimanded for that, and that's good. So this is the next thing, I think. We're just at that tipping point now. Yeah.
I think it's a question for you.
Of course you do.
I haven't read any books, so don't mind ignorance here. So I get sustainability as a general concept for stage design. That's things. I don't quite understand how it is for playwriting. And I guess as a general concept, it makes me a little bit nervous. So I recall a time probably back in the 80s when we had a series of what we call issue plays, which worried me greatly, and I avoided because that they were about a thing, not so much in my mind. Well, they were supposedly about people and characters as well, but it was all in order to push a certain point, an issue. Could you expand a bit on what these plays are?
and I still think that issue-based plays are not necessarily what I was talking about, and there is a place for them most definitely, but I think that sometimes issue-based plays are not what people want to see. They don't want to be hit over the head with an issue that they basically know about. So I entirely agree with you, Eugene. I think what is interesting about the climate Gothic argument or discussion that I pose is that rather than issue, rather than landscape or weather becoming an issue, it actually becomes a protagonist in the work or in the story. So the characters are actually responding or reacting to landscape in psychological or physical spaces, or they're reacting or responding to weather, and the weather is essentially evoking or emerging other sorts of issues about identity, place, space, what we are in the world. So I'm not actually writing about climate change plays, but the climate is inherently embedded in the work of these playwrights, and the playwrights are responding to climate in all sorts of ways. So yeah, you couldn't say the Turquoise Elephant or any of the plays I've talked about really are plays about climate change. They're actually not. So does that answer your question?
It does. I wonder if Julian, the broader 50 plays, is there a reflection of something similar across those plays?
Look, there's all kinds there. I mean, I suppose you could call Black Rock, by Nick Enright, which is one of the plays I talk about, absolutely an issue-based play, completely from start to finish. It's identified as a learning play. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but that's probably true of every play, whether they've got an issue or not. It's a concern, but it's not a critical category. That's how I describe it.
probably have time for one more question. Going once, going twice.
I've got a question. You're three leading minds in our society, speaking to into the culture. Who are the people you're reading? Who are your leaders? Who are ours? Even just one Jesus.
Oh my goodness.
Who's a mind that's spoken to you, even if it's touching on these thoughts, where you've gone, where they've pushed you beyond the boundaries of some of Australian thought, even so that we can connect these thoughts into an international space.
Deborah Bird Rose is an
Yeah.
Indigenous scholar, and she, when I first started reading her discussion on, for example, the way First Nations peoples interact with country as opposed to the way we appropriate landscape, it really shifted my way of thinking. She would be one of mine. There are a lot of scholars who are writing in that sort of eco-critical space. So how we are now, eco-criticism is a sort of theory that was always applied to literature or painting or whatever. It's now being applied to theatre and drama. And so there are a lot of studies in eco-criticism and a lot of theorists that are really interesting in that space. So, yeah. And all Australian playwrights, I read and see. I'm a great fan of Australian playwrights and performance makers.
There'll be a test.
Yeah.
He will give me a test. He's my academic supervisor.
So I can. I'm just finishing off Will Davis's book, The Limits of Neoliberalism. So I read a fair bit in economics and politics. But probably the book that I'm thinking about at the moment is Gita Sereni's biography of Albert Speer. So I finished that. I didn't think 792 pages long, and I thought, oh, this will take me a while. It took me 3 weeks. And the historical coverage of Speer as first Hitler's architect and then his minister of munitions is pretty awful, pretty confronting. But the bit that really caught my interest was the discussion of Germans after the war. And I know, but I cannot prove, and I cannot talk any further about that somehow the Australia that I know and its attitude to arts and culture is bound up with its attitude to history. I know the two problems are in a double helix. I don't quite know how they influence each other, but when I was reading Gita Sereni's very painstaking, highly discriminating, careful, and extremely empathetic discussion of basically people like us, you know, professionals, and their evasion. I thought, oh, hang on, I know some of these moves. And it's not that the two situations are commensurable, they're absolutely not. But the techniques, you know, the relentless, no, don't look back, you know, that's, you know, no, we need to look forward. The twisting of accountability, it's all completely understandable. This is not an awful, you know, these are not awful people. They're just trying to escape something. And I thought, oh my God, I think I know that.
It's so hard to pinpoint because of course I do a lot of academic reading in eco-critical, like, you know, Linda and I, like ecofeminism is a big part. For those of you in theatre who are really interested in the eco-critical, Lisa Winarski's book, Eco-Dramaturgies, is, Lisa is one of my really good colleagues, and we went through our PhDs together and we were like PhD buddies. I call her my eco-sister, and she published her book about a year and a half ago. And it's really fantastic. It sort of taps into what, sort of in the middle between what Linda and I are doing. I suppose the Donna Haraway is one of my favourite authors, and Karen Barad, but these are all very academic, I suppose. I read a really great book earlier this year that was, I have a reading group, the Ecoscenography reading group. So if anybody's interested in reading, I have an Ecoscenography reading book group that is not actually, it's got a series of books on there that are not too academic at all. It's actually just engaging with eco dialogue.
Eco themes.
Eco themes. Yeah, I can share that with you because there's a whole set of books on that we're reading this year. We're just reading at the moment. We've got Fixation. We're reading Fixation by Sandra Goldmark. Yeah.
I know you can take the microphone back. I couldn't do a launch of my book separately because I had some terrible family things happen, which we'll find out. Linda and Tanja invited me into theirs. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Julian, Tanya, and Linda. This has been endlessly fascinating, and I just really love the relationship between all of the books that we've spoken about tonight, both about the impact and also the responsibility of Australian theatre. If you could all put your hands together again.
I'd just like to say a quick thank you to Sue and the Griffith Centre for cultural research, because they actually gave me some money.
And me.
For me, the wonderful Natalie Lazarou had the awful job of proofing the first draft of my book.
Oh,
and
wow.
they actually paid for it. So thank you very much. I think probably for me, and I'm not sure for you guys, but Griffith University gave me the time, space,
Yes. And
time off to actually write the book. So thank you very much to Griffith University.
exactly. So we're all Griffith University. It's being built on university time in many ways.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
As I mentioned earlier, we do have copies of the book at the front counter. So if I could get you all to move inside, you can grab another drink up at the bar, and you can all chat and mingle. Thanks, everyone.